An Israeli official saying the war could last at least 7 more months. A deadly fire in Rafah kills more than 40 Palestinian civilians following an Israeli attack on Hamas terrorists. And after a long time, a new poll that can make Benjamin Netanyahu happy. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's Unholy, 2 Jews on the news. We will be talking with Fareed Zakaria of CNN, and we have other conversations to bring you. There is a lot going on. The week began with those incredibly distressing images you've talked about out of Rafah. You know, they are now on the news, obviously, but there's a whole other world that goes on social media. You'll have seen this hugely viral post on multiple platforms saying all eyes on Rafah, went around the world, you know, Dua Lipa did it and so on. And just because we do on Unholy try and find the odd spark of something approaching light relief in these matters, I did allow myself a momentary smile when Ben Stiller got drawn into all of this, where people thought he too was joining the many, many celebrities who were, you know, of turning their eyes to Rafah, when he did a tweet which showed the word Rafah and 3 fists in that kind of fist bump emoji. A lot of people, a lot of activists thought, well, solidarity from Ben Stiller. You know, didn't have him down as a pro-Palestine activist, but great, he's on board. But clarification soon came, Yonit. What was the clarification?
Yeah, he was talking about Rafael Nadal, and he never talks about politics. Ben Stiller, I think a few people in Israel and in the Jewish world were waiting for him to say anything, but he really doesn't. He talks solely or mostly about sports. So this is what happened, but there were so many Israelis and Palestinians, reacting to this until at some point it was, I think he had to make it clear that what he was talking about was actually tennis and not the Israel-Gaza war. It just is so indicative, Jonathan, of the way that no one can say anything, even that isn't related to this, without getting responses from every direction.
Yeah, the clue was in the spelling. He had no H on the end, R-A-F-A, and the fist pump. So he was expressing solidarity with Rafa Nadal at that moment, but people wanted it to be a declaration.
Sort of an anticlimax there.
In a way. I mean, but the nevertheless, I mean, it is not in a way an exaggeration. So all eyes were on Rafa. That was the dominant sort of the tone of the week was set by that operation on Sunday evening, where IDF announced that it had killed 2 senior Hamas figures who were there in Rafah, and one of them being a commander for Hamas activity in the West Bank, but, you know, confusingly was there located in Gaza because they can't operate openly in the West Bank. I have to say, I mean, obviously, you know this, my heart sank seeing those pictures again, the initial estimate of 45 or more Palestinians dead in the blaze that was prompted by this, many of them children. There were images on social media that, you know, were unbearable to look at, of dead bodies and so on, incinerated. I've just felt myself get to this point where I know there were arguments that were made for this operation that said, no, these are 2 very important Hamas commanders, and it was accidental because we were actually aiming at them, and it was a rogue piece of, you know, shrapnel that went off into the encampment there, and all these very flammable tents, and so, you know, it's a mishap, said Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm sort of done with all of it, to be honest with you, Yoni. I mean, with the excuses, I don't think the excuses work at all, because if you fire munitions near where hundreds of thousands of people are camping, and by the way, in the area where broadly, and I know there's some argument saying not exactly, but broadly in the area where you've told people they'll be safe, accidents will happen. You cannot drop bombs on places and not expect people to die or fires to start. And therefore, don't do it. And the reason I say that with extra strength is I don't believe the gains of an operation like this offset the huge losses. And by losses, I mean the human losses, those lives lost by those civilians in Gaza huddling and sheltering, but also the losses for Israel's own position diplomatically. You saw the Americans and Tony Blinken saying, speaking with great frustration, where is the end point for this? Whatever gains you make, in the week after, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, has said stop in Rafah, and then 2 days later, that was Friday, then on the Sunday, dozens and dozens are dead in Rafah. Whatever gains by knocking out a couple of Hamas commanders are offset by the grievous losses to Israel's standing and reputation, in which Israel acts as if it wants to confirm everything the ICJ and the ICC say about it. So I've got to that point now where people can tell me that there is strategic value, military value of this target, that target. It's all offset and outweighed by the terrible, terrible losses I think this is inflicting.
Well, I mean, the decision was made in the highest ranks of the military and the Shin Bet to take out these two Hamas operatives very close to, as you said, displaced Gazans in Rafah. Israel saying it is, as you said, we were using very precise bombs, says Israel, but there is some sort of shrapnel, and there was probably ammunitions cache, and that exploded, and then that led to fire. As you said, no one has the patience they had at the beginning. No one in the international community has the patience they had at the beginning of the war to listen to any of this. And I think it is a question to be asked. Why was that decision made? I would want to zoom out and look at the Rafah, because we've discussed this, right? The difference between the Rafah, the Philadelphia corridor, which is actually very important, and the IDF has taken control over it because that is where the smuggling, main of the smuggling happened between Egypt and Hamas in tunnels. So that is actually strategically important in this war. I think the question to be asked, and I admit I haven't received a good enough answer, is why did you leave Rafah for this point in the war when obviously everyone is losing patience with Israel? And didn't you need to start there or at least do it a few months ago? But it's clear also that the prime minister in this country has turned Rafah into I don't know if I can use that term here, right? The hill he wants to die on, in the sense of we have to go through Rafah. And you hear people, and we'll get into the politics discussion in a minute, but when you hear a minister in his own government, Gadi Eisenkot, saying it's an illusion to say you're just going to finish the 3 more battalions of Hamas in Gaza, then you're going to free the hostages. So there's an ongoing conversation, but the kernel of truth here is that it is actually an important strategic thing to do there. The question is, of course, why Israel left it to the very end, and why make this decision, as you say, to target 2 Hamas operatives who aren't Yahya Sinwar and Muhammad Def, right? Then we'd have a different conversation, and do it so close to displaced Gazans huddling and searching for shelter. I think it's a very important question.
And I absolutely take the point about the distinction between the corridor, and I can see the strategic argument around that, and taking out these individual targets. There has to be a cost-benefit analysis. Before October 7, a lot of IDF spokespeople would say with great pride, we sit around working out the targets, we weigh up the calculus, the moral calculus, the political, the strategic calculus. In this case, there's nothing that's going to persuade me that those 2 people, who are not, as you said, the highest rank, that their removal from the battlefield was worth what's come. I would also say that just the stuff around this, our friend and colleague Amos Harel reported that in the roughly 20 hours before Netanyahu gave a speech, no official political figure had bothered to express any regret over the death of those civilians in the Israeli attack, with the exception of the military advocate general, which I think is interesting because she's got an eye on the ICC and the Hague and the ICJ. So she puts out something, but the rest, nothing. And writes, friend of the podcast, Amos, even worse, mouthpieces identified with the government celebrated the civilians' deaths in a series of beastly posts on social media. He writes, Sinwar's grand plan is proceeding as planned. Jewish Hamasniks are slowly sprouting up. I find this piece of it, we're going to talk about it perhaps a bit later as well. You can make these kinds of terrible mistakes. I think, by the way, they're totally predictable. But the way you speak about them, either you don't speak about them in the case of Netanyahu himself, or his outriders speaking about them. There were all these sort of memes and jokes and things. It's just disgusting. And as you can hear in my voice, my patience for all of it is wearing very thin.
Well, these posts were since taken down. I'm not at all justifying them or explaining them. Some of them written by television talents on our competing channel, Channel 14, the events in Rafah, I think there have been at least a few Israelis saying that they are a terrible thing, and the result of it is a terrible tragedy. I don't think we need to at all discuss that. Obviously, it is a terrible tragedy when civilians die, and particularly in this way. And we should also maybe mention that the military operation in Rafah saw the return of rockets over Israel, central Israel particularly, because the north and the south have been suffering from rockets this whole time. But the central part of Israel, Tel Aviv, et cetera, have been seeing rockets this week after 4 months of relative quiet. The political arena, of course, in Israel, never quiet. We are looking at next week and the could be a very dramatic deliberations in the Israeli High Court of Justice about the draft bill. I keep pointing that as something that we should look at, because there is an option that the Israeli Supreme Court judges decide that because there is no draft bill in place and the government hasn't convinced the court that there will be one soon, there will be a requirement to enlist the ultra-Orthodox. That, of course, if that happens, we are in a whole different ballgame politically. But I would want to point out to you that we are also looking at the final days of the participation of Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot in Netanyahu's government. It is very clear. You listen to what Gadi Eisenkot is saying yesterday. And besides, apart from giving a date, with Benny Gantz already did, he said we're not staying beyond June 8th. Eisenkot giving all of the reasons why Netanyahu is failing. And again, saying, if you're selling the Israeli public on the issue of Rafah and then you're done and the hostages will be home, that's an illusion. There is a poll that came out yesterday on Channel 12, my network, essentially saying, I will remind you that in around February, Benny Gantz was sitting high on a pile of 37 seats, and Netanyahu was crushed into 18 seats by that poll. Today, we are looking at 21 seats for the Likud, which means Netanyahu is gaining some power, and 25 seats for Benny Gantz, which means he is nosediving in the poll. I think that is something we should talk about. What is actually happening here in the Israeli political arena?
Yeah, you sent me that poll, and I did like a cartoon character double take, because I looked at it and then looked again when I saw that Netanyahu on one measure, which was, suitability to be prime minister, was now ahead of Benny Gantz, having been behind, for what now feels like forever, but it's actually since October 7. And in fact, even a bit before. It's unbelievable. I mean, we always talk about the great magician, the sorcerer, Netanyahu coming back, but I think it goes to Gantz's weakness as a politician, which we talked about the last couple of weeks, this sort of boy scoutishness where he just doesn't play the hardball game you have to play. And all he did by going into this coalition was help Netanyahu. He thought he was doing his, service for the public good, very admirable. But all it did was it gave extra legitimacy to Netanyahu, and it prevented striking while that iron was so hot, which was the public anger at Netanyahu was at its peak after October 7th. That's when you move against someone. You do not stand at their side. And so, of course, and by constantly defending everything that happens, he's now diluted any kind of support he had, because he now just seems like another person in Netanyahu's government. So I'm not really surprised by that. I mean, this rising number for Netanyahu, it does raise a question. People like me, since October, have been saying, especially outside the country, when people are shocked by steps and action Israel has taken, look, Netanyahu, that's him. He's very unpopular. He's not all of Israel. If you hate something Netanyahu says or Ben Gvir, don't judge all Israel by these people. When you see a poll that says that more people think he's suitable to be prime minister than anyone else, it becomes harder to say that Netanyahu is not, Israel. Now, of course, he's not. He's speaking for a group. But when that group is the largest group, that is very troubling, because it doesn't suggest that Israeli society deplores the way this man is doing things. On the contrary, it says that many support him. And I'm partly seeing things this way because of a video which went round, and I saw it, of a Tel Aviv nightclub, a DJ's playing. He put the clip himself on social media. And he at one point plays this song, which is a kind of anthem on the far right of Ben Gvir and co., in which the song goes, "May your village burn." And he sort of pauses, as it were, for the crowd to join in that song, that chorus, clearly directed at, Gazans and so on. And the thing that got me about it is that's Tel Aviv. It's secular, liberal Tel Aviv. The Israel that people like me say, well, that's the Israel that's okay. This is not Hilltop Youth on the West Bank. This is not Ben Gvir's, legions. This is Tel Aviv, secular Tel Aviv, saying, may your village burn. You see that, you then see the opinion poll. It becomes harder to say that this government, this far-right government, isn't speaking for and representing, of course, not every Israeli, but a very, very substantial number, and not in the places you necessarily expect, including that Tel Aviv nightclub.
So there's a lot to unpack there.
I know.
Can I go?
I know.
Can I go through that a little bit?
Of course.
You'll have to be patient with me, though. Okay. First of all, I think that if we look at the poll, the reason why you're seeing a little bit of a bump for Netanyahu is, A, that many Israelis don't think the war should be over, in the sense that they think Hamas still needs to be crushed, whether you're a Netanyahu supporter or not. And the fact that he appears to be standing strong in the face of world pressure, whether it be coming from the ICJ or coming from the United States, does give him points in that regard. The other side of that, of course, is Benny Gantz weakening for two reasons. The left flank of his support is saying, what are you still doing in that government? The right side is saying, why are you making this into politics and why are you threatening to leave the government? So he's in a position where he can't win. I'll just say that generally. But I want to go into that question that you're asking. I think it's an important question. It's actually a seminal question. Is Netanyahu Israel, yes or no? If you say Netanyahu is not part of Israel, is not representing Israel, why does he keep getting elected? The reason for that, I think there are two things to look at. One is, we're not alone in this story. And you can't talk about Netanyahu's continuous victory over the past recent years without looking at what the Palestinians do and did. And the reason Netanyahu, a big part of the reason why Netanyahu was elected in the first place is Hamas and the terror attacks against Israelis when Rabin tried to go to the Oslo Accord. And the big part of why he was elected later is also the fact that the Israeli public moved more to the right in reaction to what Hamas and other terrorist groups did to Israelis. But the other thing to say is that contrary to the American system, American political system, or you know what, let's say that more accurately, until Donald Trump arrived on the scene, is that every American president needed to, in order to win, to be the 50% plus one, which means he needed to move. It's always a he. I'm sorry about that, but that's the way it is. He had to move into the center to convince Americans to vote for him. Netanyahu doesn't need the center. He never needed the center. It's a coalition government. He just needs to convince his own base. And he has manipulated the system to perfection in his own way, also adding to that the fact that he's managed to be, to convince Israelis that he's, and we'll talk about this later in our conversation with Fareed Zakaria, right, be prime minister for 16 years and still be a victim of the elites, right? But that's another point. I want to talk about your pointing out that party in Tel Aviv. Look, I think it's, obviously I don't justify it. I'm not trying to explain it. I condemn it. But I think it's important to say that this war and all of its ramifications is being documented and followed in a way that we have never seen. Every centimeter in Israel is filmed. Every centimeter in Gaza is filmed and put on social media. Why am I saying that? Because I spent very long days in New York after 9/11. I heard the conversations people were having, what they were saying about Muslims. And by the way, it wasn't them. It was their fear talking at the time. That was never put on social media. And when you think of the fact that you look at that and you say to yourself, wait a minute, this is Israel. No, it isn't. You look at that and say that's Israel. It's like taking a page out of a Yellow Pages phone book and saying, oh, wait, why is everyone here named the same way? It's just seeing a sliver of the population, of something that is going on now. And I think there's a reason why you keep seeing these pictures, because there are people trying to convince you, whether it's by minimizing what Hamas did or by saying, look how terrible Israelis are, to try and convince you, not you, Jonathan, but you, the world, that things are much more terrible in Israel, and Israel much more radicalized, much more right-wing than you'd think. I disagree with that. But I would just point out that this is one story among everything that has been going on in this country in the past 8 months.
I think what upset me about it was pretty random. It was a whole group of people who weren't there for a political purpose. They're in a nightclub. The DJ turns the sort of record down and they all sing May Your Village Burn. So there is a random element. It is a bit like a Yellow Pages phone book. But a group of secular young Tel Avivis picked at random, not there for their political views. A huge number of them are singing that. So that's what struck me about it. It wasn't just, focusing on one rally over one particular group. But I do, look, as always, I take your point, and your mention of New York after 9/11 is a good one. I would say it's 7 months, 8 months on, and there's something going on in the country which has led people to go ever further rightward. And I think that is just a reality.
Something that's going on that led them is what happened on October 7th.
I understand.
It's not a coincidence that they woke up and said, let's hate Arabs. I'm just saying.
It's months and months and months later, and the mindset is, if anything, hardening. And as always, what I always say is, it's not like they're saying, let's do this to Hamas, because that I would get. It is exactly the move you described after 9/11, where it's Muslims rather than Al-Qaeda,
I didn't ask what the rationale of the people singing is, but I do want to just point out, because we are talking about Netanyahu and this and all wrapped up in one, the person who will tap into the sentiment of the Israelis moving, you are right about the fact that they are moving to the right, but do not like Netanyahu and do not agree with him anymore. The person who will harness that political power will be the next prime minister of Israel. It won't be Benny Gantz, but it can be, again, Naftali Bennett, by the way, winning the highest percentage points in the question versus Netanyahu of compatibility. And it could be Avigdor Lieberman. It could be all kinds of people. Or Yossi Cohen. I know he was, the story coming out against him this week probably doesn't hurt him politically inside Israel. The person who will harness that, again, will be the next prime minister of Israel.
Yeah, just for people who weren't following it, that was the revelation by my own newspaper, The Guardian, that Yossi Cohen, or accusation anyway, a whole lot of evidence that Yossi Cohen sought to strong arm, pressure, intimidate, depending who you ask, the former prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, back when Yossi Cohen was sort of right hand to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Just one other political development we should mention, the thumping win, 95% landslide win for Yair Golan, one of the heroes of October 7th, as the new leader of Labour. He wants to combine Labour with Meretz and be the leader of a sort of united left. He would offer himself certainly as one of the kind of people you're talking about who believes he understands, better than most the threat that Israel faces, and yet obviously vigorously against Netanyahu. I don't think anybody is holding their breath thinking he's a future leader of the country, but something if he manages to unite that opposition, and also those calls there are for a commission of inquiry into the failures of October 7th, and to happen sooner rather than later. I think, by the way, that the thing we mentioned at the top, Tzachi Hanegbi saying this could last 7 months, is very linked to the politics, meaning all this talk of elections, and they want to come in and say, no, there can't possibly be elections now. We've still got the war to go on, which may go into 2025. They are going to kick that can down that road as long as they can, because they do not want to go to the polls, although those opinion surveys may make them change their mind if they carry on in the direction they are currently going in. All the way through, we have talked about how this war is playing out on the international stage, how the rest of the world sees it, and few people better placed in terms of observing the shifting sands of geopolitics than our guest this week.
Fareed Zakaria was named by Foreign Policy magazine one of the top 10 thinkers of the last decade. He's the host of CNN's award-winning flagship international affairs program, Fareed Zakaria GPS, a Washington Post columnist, a best-selling author of several books, among them The Post-American World and the Future of Freedom. His latest book is Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. And we're really thrilled to have him on Unholy. Fareed, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be on.
We have so many things to talk about. I actually want to begin with the end and not the beginning, if I may, and to ask you, almost 8 months into this war between Israel and Hamas, how do you see it ending?
Not very well right now, because I think part of the problem is that the Israeli government has taken an approach that is all tactics and no strategy. They have decided to go in and to go hard and to smash Hamas. But what the U.S. discovered in these insurgency operations, and this is really much more like an insurgency than a war between two armies, what they found was you had to figure out a way to protect the civilian population in order to separate them from the terrorists, from the insurgents. In other words, the Petraeus surge in Iraq which is the only successful counterinsurgency the United States has had in 50 years, was premised on the idea that the only way you're going to be able to achieve some kind of stability here is to separate the civilian population from the terrorists, then go after the terrorists, but always making the civilian population feel safe and protected, because that way you don't breed more terrorists than you kill. If you remember Donald Rumsfeld's famous comment about the Iraq War was, are we producing more terrorists than we're killing? And I think that's the dynamic I worry that Israel is in. And you can see this because they're already having to go back into parts of northern Gaza that they've cleared. They've been in Khan Yunis again. They've had to go up north again. The whole Al-Shifa hospital operation, people need to remember, was the second time they went in, suggesting the first time it didn't work. And it's not that it didn't work. It's that you can clear, but the only way you can hold is by creating some kind of legitimacy on the ground. And in the understandable fury and anger and, let's be honest, a certain desire for revenge, what Israel is doing may be, at some level politically understandable, but it's not smart because you are generating a lot of new terrorists. I don't know whether it's more or less, but that's the fundamental problem. How do you, with an operation like this, with the damage it does to the credibility of Israel, again, forget about the moral or political issues. Who's going to come in, step in over there? Who's going to ride on the back of an Israeli tank when they have just gone through the kind of ravaging of Gaza that they have? At least the people I talk to in the Arab world say, very difficult to see how, anyone, a Jordan, an Egypt, or a Palestinian Authority goes in. So to answer your question, I think Israel is going to reoccupy Gaza. And that could be years.
I think that I follow that logic, and let's say you're right. The other piece of this is the permission of the rest of the world and what they do. And we had the one of Netanyahu's advisors, national security advisors, Tzachi Negbi, saying the war will last at least 7 more months or to go to year's end. And yet signs of impatience from the Biden administration. But at what point does the world, and I particularly mean the United States, say, no, we can't let this go on as long as it's going on. We won't let Israel reoccupy Gaza. Or is the patience almost infinite? In effect, even though there'll be noise and rhetoric, in effect, is nobody ever going to stop this from the outside?
Well, let's be honest. The Israel doesn't care what the rest of the world thinks. Particularly in this feeling of it's feeling embattled. It feels like it's facing an existential threat. You can debate whether or not that's true, but I think I'm accurately describing the mood in Israel, and that's not just Netanyahu. That is, the large majority of Israelis feel very, very vulnerable at a moment like this. They have the power on the ground. Nobody in the world can stop them except the United States. And American pressure is very complicated because Biden is trying to apply some pressure, but he knows you pay a political price for that. This is something Biden knows well because he was vice president when Obama tried to apply pressure on Bibi Netanyahu, the same Israeli prime minister, on the Iran nuclear deal. And Bibi went and did a kind of end run around the president of the United States, went directly to Congress, rallied Republican support, made, which is ultimately why the whole Iran deal eventually collapsed, because Obama had to do it as an executive agreement rather than as something ratified by Congress, which meant the minute Trump came in, he could pull out of it. So Biden is well aware of that dynamic, which is he could even restrict more weapons, slow down the flow of. But then what happens on the Republican side? How much, what kind of political price is he willing to pay? I have to say, to the quote you mentioned, Jonathan, that would be a nightmare scenario for Biden politically, because let's not forget the Democratic National Convention is taking place in Chicago, just as it did in 1968. and the memory of a 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention in which you have anti-war protests against a Democratic president. And let's face it, a Democratic president who is the less eloquent successor to his predecessor. In that case, Johnson to John Kennedy. In this case, Obama, this case, Biden to Obama. That all rings, painfully accurate right now.
But I'm interested in that as an Israeli who, wants, I think, the United States and the election not to be about us at all, because I think in any way we're going to pay a price, whatever the result will be. But on the one hand, you're going to have, again, the left flank of the Democrats, protesting against Biden. Is there a voice, I don't know if it's inside the Democratic Party, maybe it's just inside the general American public, that is saying, wait a minute, you should help Israel more. Wait a minute, you should do more against anti-Semitism, that isn't happy with the Biden administration from the other side, not just the Republican Party?
Oh, yeah. You have a lot of, remember, Jews vote for the Democratic Party 70-30. It's pretty much among the high, other than blacks, Jews are the most earnestly, aggressively pro-democratic constituency the party has. And a number of those people are saying, wait a minute, don't abandon us now. This is a moment of existential threat to Israel. What about anti-Semitism? Now, to be fair, I'd say the majority of them do feel Biden has done a lot. He's stood by Israel in its hour of need. He's given them massive weapons assistance. And you can tell that it's not, this is not an act for Biden. Joe Biden believes it. He is a committed, passionate Zionist, has been that way all his life. But are there Democrats who are unhappy with this recent turn? Absolutely. And I would say, while in general, I think talking about, the money and the political action committees is largely not true, that Israel has broad support in the United States well beyond the Jewish community. But it is probably true that in the Democratic community right now, as you're gearing up for an election in which Joe Biden needs to spend $1 billion, this is not a time you want to have a lot of people who have the capacity to raise money for you very angry with you. But I think it's very important to say always when we talk about this, the support for Israel is much broader. I mean, there's the evangelical support for Israel is probably more important as a way of explaining why the United States is so bipartisan, so supports Israel in such a bipartisan fashion.
I mean, from the beginning of this, the Americans have sort of been laying out a choice to Israel, which is you can keep going harder and harder and harder militarily against Hamas in Gaza, which the Americans say they have major reservations about, particularly in Rafah. Or there is another route, they say, which is to look to alliances in the region with Jordan, with Egypt, with Gulf states. Saudi Arabia is the big prize you mentioned. And that some of the worldwide isolation will recede. We saw the ICC warrant or a request for a warrant last week. But that path goes through a Palestinian state, or at least an Israeli acceptance of a Palestinian state. Once you do that, say the Americans, then all kinds of things diplomatically unlock. As you said before, we've been saying on the podcast, this isn't just about Netanyahu. This is Israeli public opinion are very wary, to put it very mildly, of the idea of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, particularly after October 7th. Can you understand that wariness? And if you can, what would you do if you were advising the people doing the persuading, like the Biden administration? What would you say they need to say in order to reassure Israelis and bring Israelis to the point where they say, yes, we can live with the Palestinian state, and therefore we can unlock all these other promises that are there in terms of international cooperation and so on?
Well, you put it very well, Jonathan, and that is the dilemma. So on the one hand, this is the ultimate prize, right? This is what Israel has been searching for since 1948. Acceptance in the region, an end to the feeling that they were the pariah, they were the isolated one, they were the excluded one, a genuine integration politically, economically, because once Saudi Arabia does it, it becomes very difficult for anyone else. So the Saudis bankroll half the other governments there. They're the custodian of the two holiest sites in Islam. If they are able to make peace with Israel, it's a big deal. So it feels to me like the Biden administration is right, and then broader acceptance will follow, because then the European Union gets involved in the reconstruction of Gaza and all that kind of thing. But as you say, it has to go through a Palestinian state. Now, my understanding is that the Saudis are being quite reasonable. They are not asking for a Palestinian state. They are asking for a credible path to a Palestinian state. So my guess is what that means is more than a guess. I've talked to some of the people involved. There'd be a kind of timetable laid out and conditions. And, both things would have to happen. So there would have to be certain Palestinian commitments, and each one would then in turn lead you to one step further. I think what we're talking about is a demilitarized state, so that there would be no prospect of, the kind of armed threat. But you're right, there's enormous wariness and understandable wariness. Look, the story of the last, 40 years between Israel and Palestine is a strange one, because for about, roughly speaking, I'd say for the first 10 years, very little happens. And then for about 10 or 15 years, Israel makes really good faith efforts to solve the Palestinian problem, to move on a path to a Palestinian state. Two formal offers, Barak and Omer, and the Palestinians basically totally irresponsibly blow them off. But in the last 15 years, the story has been one of Bibi Netanyahu's government, and it's been of land confiscations and settlement building and arrests and no peace offers. And if anything, a kind of walking back from what even the commitments he made in the Bar Ilan speech. So I think that, it's a sort of, to me, it feels like the crux of the problem here is that it is not in Bibi Netanyahu's political interest to end this war, to find a path to a more lasting peace and a more durable peace, to find that Saudi deal that unlocks everything. For it had seemed at one point that he could do it, but right now his political interests and Israel's political interests are not aligned. Because if he were to go down that path, Jonathan, I'm not sure that the Israeli public would revolt, but I do know that two of his members of his cabinet would revolt. They'll leave the coalition. He would lose power. He then faces prosecution. I think that a leader would be able to actually, here's an alternate scenario. Bibi does that, the coalition collapses, calls new elections, and he runs a more centrist coalition saying, I'm the only guy who can credibly deliver you a safe deal with the Palestinians, because I'm Mr. Hawk. I've been opposed to this my whole life. So I'm the only, and I think Israelis would be willing to, look, Israel is fed up with this. Israel is succeeding on so many levels, technologically, economically. It has the most powerful military in the region. It has 200 nuclear weapons. This is the albatross. And if somebody could say to them, I will solve this albatross in a way that you will feel secure, even higher walls, no man's land, a DMZ between the two countries. All that stuff it's all doable. But Bibi has to be willing to lead.
We're talking about the Israeli logic, and rightfully so, but let's talk about Hamas's logic. One of the reasons we now know that Hamas went into this terrible massacre of civilians on October 7th, thus raining hell over its own citizens as well, is to thwart the Saudi deal. Why do we think that in any way now, a crucial part of this would be probably to end the war, to bring back the hostages, the 125 Israeli hostages? Why would we think that Hamas would play along with this now, at the point that they are at this junction?
No, you're 100% right, Yonit. They won't. The issue is, can you isolate them and then crush them? Again, I bring you back to Iraq. Al-Qaeda was never going to make a deal with the Americans. They, the hardest line jihadists were never going to make a deal. But what the United States was able to do was to work with the more moderate Sunni groups, isolate the Al-Qaeda-like groups, and then crush them. So there's no question you need to do military action. I've always felt that the issue was not, did you need to do military action? The issue was, could you find a way to separate? Because as Mao said, the guerrillas swim within the sea of the population. Your job as a counterterrorism operation is to separate those. Now, you may be right that particularly Palestinians in Gaza, are also radicalized. The Israeli public is radicalized. Palestinians are also radicalized. On the other hand, they probably at some level also realize that they're paying this price because of Hamas. That maybe they're sick and fed up of a life like this. So you've got to at least hope for that, because otherwise, what's the hope? There are 5.5 million of them. You've got to find some way to work with them.
Just on your point about counterinsurgency logic, which I completely agree with, by the way, on the Mao test of separating the insurgent or taking them out of the sea in which they swim, from what you've seen of how Israel's conducted this war so far, how are they doing on that measure?
Oh, terribly. I mean, and I had Petraeus on my show, and he said they're literally doing the opposite of what the surge was. They're willy-nilly, with very little regard for who is and who isn't, bombing civilian areas. Yeah, I mean, I think people are making a mistake of, I think Israel is taking more pains not to kill civilians than the public image, than the press is reporting. I don't think Israel is intentionally doing it. But they are not doing what Petraeus says, which is your first goal is to actually protect the civilians, separate them from the insurgents, then crush the ones you've isolated. It's sort of backwards. They're first going to crush the terrorists. In the midst of that, if there's collateral damage, they're not particularly bothered. They're trying to use as much accuracy as they can, but as we saw in the last few days, that only gets you so far. It's more that strategy that's missing, which is what is going to happen to the vast majority of the civilian population afterwards? How do you create a scenario where they are, comfortable with their situation, don't breed a new insurgency? What is the political authority that will be created? Petraeus spent months cajoling and seducing and wooing the various Sunni tribes to say, we need you because we want to get rid of the bad guys, but we have to find some good guys within the civilian population. And what I would say is, why is Israel not making an effort to find some people in Gaza whom it can hand over this authority to and treat them like the good guys, give them the responsibility, give them money, tell them you get to rebuild homes, of people in Gaza, and you will get all the patronage and power that comes out of that. Help us here. I see no effort on that front.
I think there have been a few efforts made, particularly by the Shin Bet, the intelligence service, but it has to come from the top. You have to have some sort of, obviously, focused leadership focusing on that question of the day after. It's a funny thing to anchor news in Israel for 20 years. Every day feels like a month, even 2 months, particularly now. And we kind of even forget that on April 13th, Iran attacked Israel for the first time directly with hundreds of projectiles, whether it's drones or ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. I mean, Israelis sort of bounced back from that, but and the attack was thwarted thanks to Israel's allies and Israel's technology. But the fact that Iran was so emboldened as to attempt to do this and to do this, how do we look at, again, we're still in this war, but what is to be done with Iran's malignant behavior, whether it be through its proxies, its nuclear plan, again, attacking Israel directly? What should be done when facing this problem?
Well, first, I want to say I think you're absolutely right to highlight this, because I don't think it kind of in a weird way got downplayed. This is very unusual. It's certainly true that Israel began this tit for tat by hitting the Iranian, let's call him a general who was in Damascus, one of the guys organizing the Hezbollah attacks on Israel. But the Iranians then chose to respond in a way that they have never responded before. 300 missiles, drones, as you say. Not only was it extraordinary because it was a direct attack from Iran into Israel, but when you're launching 300 missiles of various kinds, they could not have had the confidence that they would all get blocked. In other words, Iran was doing something where they thought 10 missiles might get through, might hit Israeli buildings, residences, schools, hospital, who knows what. And then Israel would have had to do something, and the Iranians were prepared for that. I'm just hypothesizing here I think it was a very big move on Iran's part. And it got thwarted, as you say, for a combination of reasons. But let's be honest, the vast majority of it was because of the United States. The estimates I've seen is 50% of those projectiles were intercepted by the U.S. The technology is largely U.S., so it's been the Israelis have refined it and made it better. The Jordanians helped, the Egyptians helped. It's, by the way, a good reminder to the Israelis that, again, your lasting peace comes from these alliances and from being integrated into the region. Mm-hmm. But you raised this very important question. So Iran is now, basically, I think what has happened is Iran has been driven into a box by the withdrawal of the Iran nuclear deal. They thought they had a path to some degree of better integration with the region. But then Trump pulls out of the deal, slaps secondary sanctions on them. They get isolated again. And they're not a very rich country. They're not a very powerful country. They're, if you look at Iran, its demographics are terrible, all kinds of bad, dysfunctional economy. But they are very savvy at using this asymmetrical form of power, which is their militias. So if you think about it, they've really developed a ring of militias around themselves in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, and now in Gaza, right? And if you think about what and they can't win anything, but they can disrupt, they can spoil. And that's exactly what they did. Hamas is basically the ultimate spoiling act with that brutal act of terror, as you said, directed at kind of screwing up the whole Saudi-Israeli reconciliation. The Houthis have made it almost impossible for normal trade to go through the Suez Canal. 65% of ships are now diverted. They're going, through around Africa, which adds 10 to 14 days and a lot of costs. So it's a very clever asymmetrical strategy. It also, as you know, has Israel on edge from the north. You still have 60 to 80,000 Israelis who have fled their homes. I think having not foreseen the Gaza attack, they might have overreacted and evacuated too many people or too fast. But now they're stuck in a situation where they need to do something to restore the kind of deterrence that, the Israelis used to play a game with Iran, which was a kind of escalation dominance, which is, if you hit us, we hit you harder. Mm-hmm. Well, after the 300 missiles, all Israel did was they destroyed a radar in Isfahan. Mm-hmm. That's not escalation dominance. Mm-hmm. So, you're right. There's a serious problem here. And how you get back to a more stable relationship with Iran, I think, again, it's going to require a more regional approach. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to the Americans are going to have a better working relationship with Iran. The Saudis are going to have a better working relationship with Iran. Because in a way, what you're trying to do is kind of bring the temperature down and get Iran to understand that it has some upside in not being a spoiler. Mm-hmm. Right now, as far as I can tell, there is no upside for Iran to behave better. What are they going to get? Relaxation of sanctions, return to the nuclear deal, better relations with Saudi Arabia? Nothing, right? So when you have nothing to lose, I think it places you in now, Iran is a malignant actor, but even malignant actors, there's a way to find a working relationship. We found it with Stalin's Russia. We found it with Brezhnev's Soviet Union, So that's the piece that I feel is missing.
So when you say we, and you referred a couple of times to the Americans, people now, as we approach June of 2024, think the Biden administration. But every sign and poll and all the other data points, as of now, point to a Trump 2.0, a Trump second term. Obviously, things can change, but that's how it's looking now. On these issues that the three of us have been talking about, Israel, but also Iran and the region, what happens then in that, if we have a second Trump presidency? And are people like me right to assume that the key thing about Trump is that he's very transactional and he'll just do whatever suits him in that moment? If that meant abandoning Israel in a heartbeat, he would do it for his own interest. That's my take. But what's your take on how these two, I think let's bundle the two, the Israel question, the Iran question, how do they look different under a Trump presidency?
Look, I think that this is, if I can be totally honest, Jonathan, most of my liberal Jewish friends in America have the same view, which is don't count on Trump because he might turn out to be transactional and abandon us. That hasn't been his record. Let's be fair. His record has been, for better or worse, a kind of Likudnik in the White House. He has basically been very supportive of the most hardline elements of the Israeli spectrum. He's given them everything they wanted, from the embassy move in Jerusalem. The Palestinian deal he proposed was a joke. It was something no Palestinian leader would ever have accepted. He's been trying to get Israel more integrated with the Abraham Accords. So I suspect that, whether it's because, Trump is a family man in his own strange way. And, I think that his son-in-law has a big influence on him on this issue. So I suspect you'd get, the more of the same as you did in Trump 1. The question I have is that in Israel's long-term interests? Look, let's not forget, there is this fundamental issue, which is, it's been 56 years now. You've got 5.5 million Palestinians. You're not going to give them Israeli citizenship, or that's the end of the Jewish state. What are you going to do with them? And the idea that you can just kick this can down the road forever strikes me as, particularly given, the dynamics of the last few months, it seems sort of willfully obtuse. But my suspicion is that's what you get from Trump. From Trump, you'd get, what Bibi wants, which is, we're not going to say anything. You keep doing whatever you need to. If you need to confiscate more land, do it. If you need to take, but ultimately, I do worry that that's just Israel is sitting on a powder keg.
I do want to ask about the book, and we mentioned the Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the present, essentially trying to understand what rapid changes do to society. And I'm wondering how that plays, since we are in this kind of backlash now in the United States particularly, how does that play into the elections that we're seeing now?
It shows up frontally in the fact that you have this bizarre situation where the U.S. economy is doing better than really it's almost ever done. Unemployment is at a 50-year low. Inflation is down to 3%. Inequality is getting alleviated. The wages of the bottom 20% have been growing faster than the top 20% for the last 2-3 years now. Black labor participation is higher than white labor participation. And yet, Biden has the lowest approval ratings of any president in American history. I think what's happened is the cord between economics and our political identity has been broken. We're living in an age of cultural politics, and we're living through a great cultural backlash over these last 30 years of kind of globalization, cosmopolitanism, liberalism. By the way, the same thing is happening in Israel. The decline of the Ashkenazi elite that ruled Israel for the first 50 years of its existence, and the backlash against it and against those values and that cosmopolitanism and liberalism is very much a piece of what's going on in the United States, what's going on in India with Modi, Erdogan in Turkey. So, we're all trying to kind of figure out how we navigate through it. In America, I have to say the forces are actually a little bit less unequally aligned than when we think. Because remember, Joe Biden will win this election by 8 million votes. In any other democratic system in the world, without an exception, he would win. It is only because we have this very complicated electoral college system that we talk about this being a razor-thin, election, etc. The Republican Party since 2000, in the last 24 years, has won the popular vote only one time. George W. Bush's re-election in 2004. Every other time they've lost, that doesn't mean they haven't been president. There have been a series of Republican presidents, but all elected as minority presidents. So it is what it is. We have the system we have. I'm not saying we can undo that, but in America, actually, the forces are a little bit more, at the very least, equally balanced. In places like Israel, in Turkey and India, there is this enormous value politically these days to being able to say, I'm not one of those elites. I'm not one of those guys who's been empowered by the last. I'm the outsider. And there are some people who are particularly clever at it, like Bibi and Modi, who can both be insiders and outsiders at the same time, right? Bibi Netanyahu is able to claim, in some sense, the mantle of, all the elites hate me. Well, you've been prime minister for the longest time anybody has ever been prime minister in Israel. If you're not an elite, what is the definition of an elite?
How can you be the victim of the elite while being the leader for 16 years?
Yeah.
Before we leave you, because you are one of America's foremost public intellectuals, the state of the academy in America has gathered a lot of attention around the world with the campus protests at universities and so on. And people saying that this indicates some wider trend. For some people, it means a sign that something has gone badly wrong in American education. Other people say it's wonderful and very inspiring, all these young idealistic people. But definitely something is different in the American academy. How do you see it?
I think that the Jewish groups that were protesting about the way in which colleges handle this were basically right. By which I mean to say, they pointed out a hypocrisy at the heart of the way the whole thing was being done, which was that the American Academy had drifted towards a kind of policing speech in various kinds of ways, anti-Black speech, anti-Native American speech, anti-Hispanic speech, anti-minority speech of all kinds. And then suddenly, when it was the Jews who asked for that protection, these university presidents said, well, freedom of speech means people can say whatever they want. Now, the proper thing, in my view, is not for Jews to be one more protected category for whom you can then violate freedom of speech. The proper thing would be to reverse the whole policy and say, look, everybody has to have thick skin if you're going to be at a university. We intend you to be physically safe, and we will ensure that you're physically safe if anyone threatens you. But you know what? Life stuff. And if somebody wants to argue that the Civil War was a big calamity for America, you got to hear that, and you got to have your best arguments that you can marshal against it. And we drifted very far from that. So I think they caught a kind of growing illiberalism on campus, a growing lack of devotion to intellectual standards and spirited debate, and instead of that, a kind of coddling and an ideological kind of litmus test that was being applied, which is all, I think, bad. I do think it's being corrected. I do think we're seeing kind of a course correction. I don't know if you saw, but Harvard came out and said that they will essentially no longer institutionally take a position on anything. I suspect that even if people don't admit to that, they are going to in fact do that. But I wouldn't overread it, which people tend to do. Young people, college kids they are crazy. They're and maybe they should be crazy. When I was in college, I was sort of in the college in the early 80s. We still had people who believed in, communists and Sandinistas should win in Central America, and people who wanted the nuclear freeze and thought that Reagan was crazy to call the Soviet Union an evil empire. And they built tents and protested, and there were shanty towns against South Africa. The generation before me, there were people protesting in favor of the North Vietnamese government. There were people, the Harvard Crimson editorialized when Pol Pot took over Cambodia in favor of Pol Pot, saying that he was an agrarian reformer and maybe he should be given a chance. So, the thing to remember is these kids say all this stuff, and then 2 years later, they're working at Google or Goldman Sachs or McKinsey. How radical are they really?
I'm quoting Bill Maher saying to you, I think it was a few weeks ago, it's not that I've gotten older, it's that your ideas are stupid, right? That was his quote. Fareed Zakaria, we appreciate this so much. We could have gone on and on with this, but we know you're a busy man, and we really appreciate you carving out some time for us. So thank you so much for talking with us on Unholy.
It was a very spirited, fun conversation. Thank you for having me.
I'll never think of agrarian reformers the same way again, Fareed. Thank you very much for that. Well, so he's such a sharp observer of the international scene. It's so interesting to hear someone like Fareed Zakaria's take on all of this and saying, in a nutshell, what's missing is the strategy. And we've been talking about this for a long time, how there are people from the left and right who just think that's their single biggest criticism of Netanyahu's conduct of the war. And I thought it was very salient the way he said that what had to happen, and I've heard it myself from American military folk, you had to isolate Hamas, then crush them, is how he put it. But you had to separate Hamas from the population. And he said, I see no effort on that front. He feels that Israel, Fareed Zakaria said, that Israel has not done what it needed to do to separate Hamas from the population.
Yeah, I'm not sure there wasn't an effort. I think Israel did make the effort. It could not have, as we said, in some ways not been successful. But I agree that it was very interesting to hear his thoughts on everything about what is going on in the war and how can this end, and if there is indeed the silver bullet that is the Saudi deal. I mean, where are we heading, I think, is a big question that we've been asking in the past couple of weeks. We have wanted for a long time to begin these series of conversations with, prominent Jewish journalists around the world, and to hear what is happening to their community vis-a-vis October 7th, but not only. And I think we have one of those conversations today.
Michael Gawenda is one of Australia's best-known journalists. For many years, he was a columnist, feature writer, editor on Time magazine, and he is a former editor-in-chief of the Age newspaper. He is also the author now of a book called My Life as a Jew. Michael Gawenda, welcome to Unholy.
Good to be here.
There's lots to talk about with you, particularly because of this new book of yours, My Life as a Jew, and we're going to get onto that. Tell us a little bit about these demonstrations that were held across Australia.
Well, they were basically organised by a couple of Christian groups. They're not Christian Zionists. They're local Christian groups who have been involved in Christian-Jewish dialogue in Australia. They basically organised the demonstrations. They were demonstrations basically against anti-Semitism. They were held in every capital city in Australia. It would be wrong to say that hundreds of thousands of people turned out. There were perhaps 10,000 in Melbourne, perhaps the same number in Sydney, a few thousand in Brisbane, and smaller numbers still in Adelaide. I don't think that there was ever any chance that we were going to have huge demonstrations against anti-Semitism in Australia. I think people just don't come out for that sort of demonstration.
Can you elaborate a little bit about, because obviously we've been talking diaspora Jews, a lot about the United States and about the United Kingdom, but talk us through the sort of Australian response or conversation since October 7th. How did that sound? How does that sound like?
Well, there are, I suppose within the Jewish community, there has been overwhelmingly concern and support for Israel. I would say there has been support for the action that the Israeli government has taken in Gaza. I think in the main, this is a community that is deeply Zionist. Probably greater numbers of people proportionally have visited Israel than probably any other country. We probably have more Jews in Australia, Australian Jews who have made Aliyah, proportionally than any other country. You've got to remember this is in the main a Jewish community that was built after the war, basically by Holocaust survivors. The pre-war Jewish community was mostly an Anglo community. Jews had been part of the Australian landscape since the first fleet. Since the first convicts were shipped to Australia, there were Jews amongst those convicts, as you would expect, I guess. but it was a very Anglo community. It was transformed basically by the influx of Holocaust survivors after the war, and they were in the main in Melbourne. They were mostly East European Jews, Polish Jews, Russian Jews. In Sydney, they came from Hungary, so the communities are different in a way. But nevertheless, I think for most of the Holocaust survivors, many of whom came from DP camps, the establishment of the State of Israel was a miracle, was kind of in the depths of the darkness that they had gone through. Israel kind of, in a way, almost literally saved their lives, gave them hope for a future that they didn't have. And I think they've passed that on. So what am I saying? I'm saying this is a very Zionist community.
Okay, so that's how the Jewish community talks about October 7th. What about the general population? How do Australians talk about this?
I think that in the main, Australians, according to all the polls, have been very supportive of Israel. And that is reflected in consistent polling from October the 7th onwards. That support for Israel, which is around between 60 and 70%, has remained constant despite the constant showing of the horrors that have been going on in Gaza. I'm not saying people haven't been concerned about those horrors, but it hasn't led to any decrease in the support for Israel and for Israel's right to defend itself, and even for the action that Israel has been taking. On a political level, you have a different situation. We have a Labor government that I think has found it very difficult. Traditionally, we've had bipartisan support for Israel in this country across the Conservatives, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. I think that has now been fractured. Labor has moved away from that consensus and continues to move away from it. For instance, the Labor government, the Labor Prime Minister, refused to say anything about the recent ICC decision to charge Netanyahu and Gallant with war crimes. He has said that's a matter for the court. Now, that's a big deal in Australia because our main ally, Joe Biden, called it outrageous. We said it's up to the court. We trust the court. The court has our support. We are a foundational member of the court. Now, for the Jewish community in Australia, this was a very difficult thing to handle because how they saw it was that the Labor Party, the Labor Prime Minister, was equating Hamas with the Israeli government. The Australian position in the UN, we supported the recent General Assembly resolution about Palestine, which was a change in policy, a significant change in policy. I'm saying that on the left in Australia, there is no doubt there has been a significant move away from support of Israel to something that is approaching support for a one-state solution in Palestine, Israel.
That's a pattern going on across progressive politics around the world. We've talked about it on the podcast, and it's fascinating to hear that it's going on in Australia too. I want to move to your book, My Life as a Jew. You chart your journey there as a Jew. You write, "In old age, I am a Jew in transition." And it is quite a shift the way you describe it there. And obviously I know as well as anyone how hard it is to try and to distill and summarize an entire book into a single answer on a podcast. But just guide us, what kind of Jew you were before and what kind of Jew are you now?
I was a secular, left-wing Jew who who expressed whose Jewishness, and I got this from my home and from my upbringing. I was, from a very young age, very involved in Yiddish culture and grew up in, Yiddish was my first language, and grew up reading Yiddish, speaking Yiddish, being involved in a youth group where Yiddish was spoken. It was a non-Zionist youth group. I had very little connection with Zionism, with Israel, and that was the environment in which I grew up. As I got older and into my teens, into my early adulthood, that's the sort of Jew I was. I was a peripheral Jew, I reckon. I was not involved in Jewish communal life. My life was involved in many ways, in journalism. I considered myself an Australian journalist. I covered Australian issues. I never thought of myself as a Jewish journalist. I didn't much think about, in fact, I hardly ever thought about the fact that I was the first Jewish editor of the Age newspaper, a paper that had a history of over 150 years. It never mattered to me. It wasn't something that concerned me. What changed was when I had children. When I had children, I thought, what does it mean? What will it mean for these children of mine that they have been born Jewish? What? When they ask me, what does it mean? What will I tell them? What do I want for them in terms of their Jewishness? And it struck me, for reasons that I can't explain, that I had deep within inside me this commitment to Jewish continuity. I wanted them to be Jews. My parents wanted me to be Jewish. I think they didn't live long enough to be terribly disappointed in the Jew I had become, which was a Jew in name only. But that question of, do I want them to be Jewish? And if I want them to be Jewish, and I do, how will I ensure that they are? And then I thought, the sort of Jew I was, there is no passing that on. I have nothing to pass on to them, really. And so that's how I began the journey of, well, what sort of Jew can I become that will actually be able to pass on to my children something substantial about what it means to be a Jew. At the same time, something happened to me about Israel. I think that I realized that this place meant something to me beyond just a place where the Jewish people established a form of self-government, a national state. And as a journalist, I was curious. As a Jew even, I was curious about what that meant. But what I realized when I visited was that I had deep feelings about this place. I had connections to it that I had denied. I even felt that I was already not such a young man, but I was much younger than now, that I had missed out on partaking in what was one of the greatest events in Jewish history, the re-establishment of Jewish sovereignty in this place where Jewish sovereignty had not existed for 2,000 years. And that I could have been part of that journey, that development, that historic development. And at that point, I started saying to my wife, we should go and live in Israel. For two reasons. If we want to make sure our kids are Jewish, we should go and live in Israel. And we should go in Israel because we want to be part of this enormous thing that has happened to the Jewish people in our lifetimes. And so Israel became increasingly important to me. Israel became increasingly a place for which I had affection, a place which I thought had achieved miraculous things. And so some sort of screen fell off my eyes. And at that point, I realized that many people that I grew up with and many people that I associated with on the left, Jewish people, didn't have that view about Israel. And that this was going to be an issue for me and for them. And it was going to be an issue beyond that, publicly, as a journalist, as an editor, as a person involved in public life in Australia.
Michael, I think a lot of this is related in a chapter in your book that's called "Falling for Israel," in which you say, among other things, that it's a kind of love, and you say it's a bold, startling statement even to me. But I want to say, because at the end of it, you didn't move to Israel; you still live in Australia. So, how is Israel part of that identity for you and for your children today? How does that play into your Jewish identity?
For me, the time for going had passed. It hasn't passed for my children. My children are more connected with Israel through music, through friends, through going there than ever I was. My son is learning Hebrew, has been learning Hebrew. These are one of the things that I thought was always a barrier in terms of having a true connection with Israel. I didn't know the language. So I think for my children, they have, in a sense, taken me on this Israeli journey. I believe there's a chance that my son will eventually settle in Israel. And once he does that, my life is going to change as well, because I can't imagine a life where I won't spend significant time in Israel with my son and whatever family he might develop there. So
no pressure.
No pressure. So no pressure. Actually, there's lots of pressure.
That's what I meant by no pressure.
Yes, but let's pretend there's none. I think when I say in my book, my journey is not completed. I'm still on this journey. Partly it's about Israel, where I will end up in terms of Israel, and also where I will end up in terms of what sort of Jew I am, in terms of my connection with Judaism. So the Jewish part of my book was a search for, is Jewish continuity for me important? And if it is, how do I go about ensuring that my children and my grandchildren will be Jews?
That is entirely very interesting. And we really thank you for coming on Unholy. The book is called My Life as a Jew. And Michael, thank you so much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So interesting to hear that perspective from, where I'm sitting, the other side of the world, and just realizing these issues, particularly the issues that Jewish communities outside Israel are wrestling with, are the same. There are echoes of them all over, whether it's, Australia or Austria. They are these similar dynamics. Britain, America, these big diaspora communities are going through something, and just a very, very different take from someone who's such a sort of seasoned observer of all this as Michael Gawenda.
Yes, and also a shout out to a big Jewish community in Australia. I think, I'm ashamed to say, this might have been our first interview with an Australian in the 3 years we've been doing this podcast. Shame on us. But
yes,
I'm really glad. I'm really glad we did this conversation. As I said, we will continue our tour between Jewish journalists around the world to hear from them. As you said, a lot of the challenges are the same, but each community has its own unique issues and challenges. So, award season, always on Unholy. Do we go into the mentor, the chutzpah? Who goes first?
I think you should go first, because this is exquisite act of chutzpah. And I think the committee ratified this one very rapidly.
I mean, it's so beyond chutzpah, but we'll try and squeeze it in the category. This week and last week, Channel 13 in Israel aired a 2-part expose an investigative report into the inner trappings of the transportation minister, Miri Regev, and the way that she operates. It really is, that cliche, no one wants to see how a sausage is made. Well, a lot of Israelis wanted to see how a corrupt sausage is made. And it was really a detailed account. He had, Raviv Drucker, who's the journalist behind this program, had the best sort of deep throat you can, which is Regev's former chief of staff. And he gave everything in this expose, all of the information, correspondence, documents, all of them leading you to the alleged charges would be that she essentially prioritized local projects in transportation in relation to the way that these local places can help her in the Likud primaries. It is pretty shocking to think about that, but it was a very detailed account about how this thing actually works. The Attorney General is already taking a look at this, but it was really, again, the inner workings of this machine and her sort of inner, her closest advisors, the way they talk to her, the ways she talks to them, and actually the sort of hierarchy of local municipalities in Israel by color and who are we going to help and who are we not going to help, again, predicated on their possibility to help Miri Regev in her personal political journey. It really was a shocking thing to say.
Let's remember this one next time people have a go at journalists like us for reading the politics in things and saying, this decision, it may look like that, but we know it's political. It's about settling scores or helping friends. This is how the sausage gets made, exactly as you say. It reminded me a little bit of the Chris Christie affair. Do you remember with the closing of the bridges in New Jersey? He closed a couple to inconvenience local leaders who had crossed him in some way. I mean, he bounced back and has become one of the most eloquent antagonists of Donald Trump. So who knows what future awaits Miri Regev. Somehow I'm not holding my breath, but a worthy winner. I have a feeling we've given her the award before. Actually.
Could be.
I don't feel this is Miri Regev's first
new,
rodeo.
Right?
I don't think so. So an award for her. The Mensch category, my eye has been drawn by plans. It hasn't happened yet. It's actually scheduled for Monday in Jerusalem. An interfaith march together. People from a whole lot of different communities, Jewish, Muslim and Christian. There'll be Druze there. There'll be representatives Bedouin from the Negev, even I'm told the Scottish Church, as well as obviously lots of Jewish groups really calling for peace and solidarity between communities. And the Mensch, I think, is the organizer behind it, Avi Dabush, who is a survivor of October the 7th. He is himself displaced and living way outside his regular home. He's been involved as a rabbi and a social activist. And he notes that this gathering happened this time last year in very, very different circumstances, representatives of all faiths. He's put out a picture where you can see him, but just over his shoulder is Vivian Silver, the late Vivian Silver, peace activist, and one of those kibbutznikim who was murdered on October the 7th. And so there's extra poignancy to this year's gathering, but I would say also an extra need, really, for these even quite small gestures of togetherness across the many, many divides. So a Mensch Award on his way to him and to all the people who are planning to be there at 4:00 on Monday in Jerusalem.
So we are winding up our show. We will say our thank yous to Gaia Glaser and to Omer Primet and to Omri Barak. And we shall see each other, I have this feeling, next week, Jonathan.
See you then, Yonit.
See you.